Hey guys, this is Colin at ShiftSynth1. Today we're going to be wrapping up the synth engine aspect of the Novation Circuit Editor. So we're going to be covering the envelope generators, the distortion, the chorus, and the equalizer. Now I know that may seem like we're going to be covering a lot of ground, but honestly a lot of these concepts are difficult to illustrate while not being that hard to explain. So I'm going to go ahead and plow through them all, and hopefully we can get through this in about 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to start with the envelopes today. Envelopes are a fundamental building block of synthesizing. I'm not going to go too much into the mechanics of ADSR envelope generators. There's a ton of information on the internet about ADSR envelopes and how these can be applied. I encourage you guys to read up on those if you don't know what these are. But essentially, attack is how long it takes for a sound to reach peak. Decay is how long it takes from peak to get to a sustain level. Sustain is the level at which the envelope settles at, and release is the time it takes to go from sustain to zero again. So the amp envelope here contains a standard ADSR envelope, and there's an extra knob here for velocity. And velocity is simply the sensitivity of the pads to volume. So if I take velocity all the way up, if I press slightly, it will sound very soft. You can barely hear it. But if I press hard, you'll hear it sound pretty hard. So that's what velocity does. And you can turn it negative, which will have the opposite effect. If I press softly, it'll sound loud. And if I press hard, it'll sound soft. So that's what velocity does. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the filter envelope because I think conceptually a filter envelope is much more difficult to understand than an amp envelope. Amp envelopes are directly corresponding to sound, and they're very tangible and easy to understand and easy to hear. Filter is a little bit more difficult. The filter envelope fits within the amp envelope because if the amplitude is 0, you can't hear a filter, right? So what does it mean for a filter to have a release? So that was a concept that was kind of difficult for me to wrap my head around because oftentimes I would shape an amp envelope to have a release that was long or short, and I couldn't really hear the effect of the filter release on that amp envelope. So I'm going to actually illustrate that for you guys today a little bit, and I want to talk to you guys about velocity as it relates to the filter envelope. So we're going to start with the velocity. It's the same concept as the amp envelope, except instead of triggering how loud the note sounds with how hard you press the key, it's triggering the level of the frequency. So I'm going to set the wave to square because it's super easy to understand frequency with square waves. I'm going to take the frequency down to give us some space with the filter envelope, and I'm going to turn the velocity all the way up. So if I press this note softly, the filter will be barely opening. It basically sounds like a sine wave. Now if I press it hard, it should open up the filter since the velocity is positive, and we'll hear a much brighter tone. So I forgot something here, which is the envelope to frequency module. So we have to turn that up in order for us to apply the filter envelope to the filter. And I explained this in our last lesson, but make sure that's turned on if you want a filter envelope to affect it. If I press this again softly, you can't hear the filter open, but if I press it hard, you can hear that filter open. Now notice you probably heard it dip a little bit there, and that's because the filter envelope is affecting that. And the decay here is set at 75, and the sustain is kind of low, so you could hear it peak and then drop really quickly, and that's what that filter envelope's doing. Let me take the release of the amp up all the way here. So when I press the key, it'll have a long tail to it. So I let go, and you can still hear it ringing. So now let me take the velocity down. So that means that the filter envelope to the filter is not contingent on how hard I press the key. but the amp envelope is very high. So notice that the release here is at 45. So it's not going to be nearly as long as the release of the amp envelope. So what we should hear here is the amp to tail for a very long time, but the filter will close before that amp envelope releases all the way. So let's try this out. That was really quick. You could hear it. You can still hear the amp envelope, but the filter closed. So that's what the filter release does. So let me take this now all the way up to 116, so it matches that of the amp envelope. So what would we expect now? What we'd expect is that the filter envelope stays open for as long as the amp envelope is releasing. There you go. So now let's play around a little bit with the attack. Attack is the exact opposite of release. So if this is turned up high, we'll hear the attack slowly approach and then release with a slow tail because release is set to high. But the amp envelope attack is very low. So we'll hear that come in immediately. So let's see what that sounds like. It's opening. And if I release it here, it's tailing off, just as I expected. Okay, so that's about all I wanted to cover with the filter envelope. The envelope 3 is a different monster altogether. Basically, this guy can be assigned to any destination in the mod matrix. It can even be assigned to the filter envelope. So if I go down here to destination, the filter frequency is on here. So why would you choose envelope 3 instead of the filter envelope? Well, envelope 3 has this guy right here. It has delay. So if you want your note to have tone and then slowly open up the filter instead of opening up the filter simultaneously with the amp envelope, you're going to have to use envelope 3. So here, let me initialize the patch again. Now envelope to frequency is 0, but we're not going to be using the filter envelope here. So I'm going to take the frequency down again to give us some leeway. I'm going to turn the delay up here, and I'm going to turn the attack up to like 80. So we're going to take the source, we're going to make that envelope 3, and we're going to turn the destination to the filter frequency. Let me take the depth up here. Make sure that you're taking the depth up, because that is the same thing as the envelope to frequency at this point, right? So let's give this a shot. What does this sound like? It's very soft, but you'll hear it come in. And there you go. So it delayed the effect of the filter envelope. That concept can be applied to any of the destinations. It's just an additional envelope that can be applied in a different way. So let's try something else here. Let's try the LFO 1 rate. So I'm going to take the LFO, I'm going to turn up the frequency here so we get a clear sound. Great. I'm going to apply the low frequency oscillator here to oscillator 1 pitch and turn this up and see what that sounds like. Great. So we are going to be modulating the low frequency oscillator 1 rate with the envelope 3. So let me take the attack up, and I'm going to take the delay down. So it should kick in a lot faster. But the attack is really high. So this modulation should come in slowly, and it'll slowly increase the low frequency oscillator rate. So let's try this. It's going into tonality at this point, and it should back off. There you go. So that just about summarizes the envelopes. This is a cornerstone of synthesis. It's something that you should spend a ton of time on. So moving on, distortion is very similar to the filter drive that we covered in the last lesson. The types are exactly the same. However, they impose this modulation source here called the comp. And comp is only applicable to the diode in the valve settings. it enables you to soften the distortion of those two. I'm not going to go over what these are. If you want to check the manual, feel free. They have detailed descriptions of each of these. To me, they don't really mean much. I just go with whatever sounds best for the patch that I'm currently developing. But I do want to show you what comp does. So I'm going to pick diode. I'm actually going to reinitialize the patch, and so we don't have the low frequency oscillator or the envelope 3. I'm going to take diode and turn up the level, and I'm going to take comp all the way down. And actually, I'm going to change the wave to a square wave so that it's easier to understand what the distortion is doing. So yeah, as I turn up the comp, it is softening that diode distortion. So that's what this does. And level is just the level of the distortion that is applied. Chorus is a lot deeper section. There are two types of chorus, a phaser and chorus. And they each apply different types of modulation to the sound. The best way to understand them is by listening. Rate sync, you will notice that these align with the rate sync that in the low frequency oscillator, and I went through that in detail in that lesson. So if you don't understand what's happening here and you want to learn what these various metrics mean, please refer to my second lesson on the low frequency oscillators. Basically, this section will sync this chorus rate to your Novation Circuit's internal clock. Rate is a standard rate that is not tied to the Novation Circuit's internal clock. Feedback will route the chorus back into itself to create an echo effect. So I want to demonstrate that one for you guys. I'm going to turn the phaser to chorus actually and turn the level up because the level is the same as distortion. It's just the amount of chorus applied to the sound. And we are going to take that feedback up. A very clear effect on the sound. Now, feedback negative will invert the feedback. So let's see what that sounds like. It's actually a distinctly different sound, which I think is pretty cool. Mod depth will just accentuate the severity of the chorus. So if I take the feedback up here to like 40 to give us a nice crisp chorus, and then I turn up the mod depth here, you can hear it thin out to nothing. Mod depth at 0 means there is no chorus applied to the sound. Delay is a tricky one. It's the amount of delay applied to the sound. Now with chorus, that's not really recognizable since it's constantly going throughout the spectrum of the sound. So the way Novation really intended for delay to be used was a modulation source. However, if your feedback is high, delay does have an impact on the sound. So I want to demonstrate that first before I modulate it. I'm going to turn the feedback way up, and I'm going to take the delay down. Turn up the mod depth a little bit. So yeah, if the feedback is really high, the delay does have an impact on the quality of the sound. However, if the feedback is low, you won't hear it. But if I move the delay, you will hear it because the delay is being changed while the chorus is going. So you can assign a chorus delay to a macro knob right here, and then record that modulation in the Novation Circuit's macro recording function. So that's just an option. I do want to point out that chorus functions much better with a low rate. It sounds better. It gets you a much better chorus effect, and phaser works a lot better with a high rate. So that sounds a lot more phaser-ish. If it's low, it doesn't really catch that quality. The equalizer section is pretty useful. Basically, this is used to audio engineer the sound a little bit to balance out some of the tones that you're going to be getting from your patches. So the frequency for low, mid, and high have different definitions. So we're going to go over the frequency first, which will then make explaining gain much easier. So low frequency, if set to 0, allows for a frequency of 140 Hertz to be adjusted by the gain. And if it's max, it's 500 Hertz. So think of it this way. As I decrease the frequency, the range in which the gain is applied is shrunk. And if it's 0, only the very low end of the frequency is amplified. The frequency mid adjusts the center frequency. So if I move the frequency up to max, the center frequency is 2.2 kilohertz. And if I adjust the frequency down, the center is at 440 hertz. So there's a huge range here. If the high frequency is maxed, then the gain is applied to 4.4 kilohertz. And if it's 0, the gain is applied to 650 hertz. So as we move up, the gain is up to a higher range of tones in the high frequency spectrum. Gain is the same for each function. It basically is positive or negative. It will amplify or reduce the tonal range established in the frequency parameter. The Placebo Pro, I don't think it does anything. I think this was just extra space. And the patch store section, this is actually a link to the Isotonic store. So if you want to go there and shop around. Well guys, that just about covers the whole synth engine. We're not done yet. I still want to cover the session mode and the random and morph functions. So stay tuned and I will address those in our next lesson. I'll see you guys later. Bye.